Well, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Adam Austerfield. I'm a visiting fellow in LSE Ideas and also in the Fundación Blanch Centre at the London School of Economics. It's a great pleasure to be hosting another in our virtual masterclasses from the London School of Economics with the support of the Fundación Ramón Areces, which has been an outstanding partner of the LSE for a decade. As my colleague here, Luca, knows very well, we were able to provide a number of faculty to the Madrid headquarters and run a series of masterclasses in social science since 2012, and are now producing these events online for a wider audience, and also to ensure that the continuation of the relationship with the Fundación, which is very important to the LSE, may continue through these difficult COVID times. So we're very grateful to the Foundation for supporting and being a great ally and a partner of the LSE, and all of us and our colleagues in Madrid and around the world for taking part in these programs. So thank you. Today, we're going to look at the role of finance in climate change, a key issue which has been a relatively new field of finance over the last couple of decades and is growing to become one of the most important in the challenges that climate change is facing for adapting all kinds of policies for the way in which the international community can address some of the main challenges we have in climate change. So financial markets are of increasing importance and increasing impact. So we're going to look much more closely at that today. It's a relatively new field, but it's a huge field. So we felt today's seminar would benefit from some explanations from our two expert speakers in this field to help explain and illustrate some of the key issues surrounding the role of finance in climate change. First of all, we have Luca Taschini. Luca, welcome back to the Foundation as a regular contributor in the past. It's great to have you back. Luca is a research fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on climate change at the LSE, where he was formerly also a senior Dahrendorf fellow. He's a member of the Energy and Climate Economics Research Group in Munich, Germany, and he has a PhD in finance from Zurich University and also teaches at the University of Edinburgh. We also have Dr. Theodor Cojoianu. Thank you very much for joining us today, who is an assistant professor in finance at Queen's University, Belfast. Theodor's work is at the intersection between sustainability, data science, and finance, and is focused on applying innovative research methods to the study of sustainable development issues. He's also critically advising the European Commission's platform on sustainable finance as a key contributor, and he advises the Commission there on EU sustainable finance policy. So we're delighted to have both of you today on this LSE seminar in collaboration with the Foundation. Luca, we're going to hand over to you first of all to give us something of an overview perhaps and a setting of the scene in the role of finance in climate change. We'll then ask Theodor to also discuss his point of view on green finance taxonomy, and then we'll have some more discussion after that. But Luca, over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Adam. Always a pleasure to be with the Fundación. And it has been always fantastic to meet people and discuss, sadly not in person this time in Madrid. And thank you very much for inviting myself and Theodor. So I would like to start with a brief of an introduction about the case of what's the role of finance in climate change. And I would like to start with a very particular latest presentation. It has been a month with a lot of reports from the IMF, from the Bank of England, Bank of International Settlements, the World Bank, and in particular, the latest one from the International Energy Agency. They expedite the publication of their flagship World Energy Outlook just before the COP. And it was, I believe this is an excellent and a comprehensive guide to thinking about where we are in the carbon transition and what remains to be done. Earlier this year, the International Energy Agency presented their energy market projections consistent with the very famous and popular net zero global emissions by 2050. And what we understand is that what is clear is that there's no room for investing in any new oil and gas exploration. So existing reserves are more than enough to meet all the demand compatible with the decarbonization of and by the deadline of 2050. So now this particular illustration that I have here, it's coming from the latest World Energy Outlook. And I believe help us to focus our thinking by comparing the net zero scenario with two other scenarios of how energy use in general and production will evolve. One is the so-called announced pledge scenario, in which countries do what it takes to make good on the decarbonization promises that they have made so far. And the other is called the stated policy scenario, which looks at what countries currently do and not what they say they are doing or will be doing. The contrast between those two at the net zero tells, I believe, a striking story, a story that will help us understanding how and what is the role of finance in climate change. So what is the striking story is that countries at the present time, they're not acting to achieve what they have pledged to do, but there is even a more, I think, important policies that is we need to move from the stated policy to the announced pledges in a very fast pace. So this is at the level of a country. If we now translate the projected net zero at the company level, that picture might be not that different when considering basically the individual companies' announced pledges and their actual emission reduction. Mind you, I'm talking about emission reduction, not promises to offset their emissions. So in short, what this picture tells us is that there is an enormous amount of political and policy change that still has to happen, and that we will probably see in the next years. So now, what we understand from the previous picture is it basically gives us a sense of the magnitude of the challenge, the magnitude of what is the carbon budget, how much we can burn in order to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees. Crucially, what is now important is to decide how to spend this budget. This is a relatively complicated and obviously consequential decision. Together, China, US, Europe, and India account for more than 50% of the global greenhouse gases emission, as this chart on the left-hand side illustrates. What those four nations do will be obviously one of the key aspects to solve the world's climate problem. When classed by activities around and that's again important if you think in terms of what is the role of finance, 1/3 or around 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emission come from producing electricity. That's obviously where most of our attention usually goes, into the electricity sector. But I think it's also important to look at the industry and the transportation. They approximately account for 1/5 each. And industry, I mean, including manufacturing and construction sector. And also emission from agriculture are quite significant. That's another sector that I think is extremely important, where we don't necessarily have the means, the technology, the innovation that we required. Okay, so how to allocate the world's carbon budget across country and the geopolitical decision that flow from this, I think is a huge, or is hugely important for investor for a variety of reasons. It is because basically we need to understand what are the sectors that need to do certain things. Now, the important things to also keep in mind is that the ability to decarbonize quickly and cheaply differs more across sector than it does across countries. And that's the reason why I'm actually posting this picture. This tells us that at the moment, most of our attention is in the energy sector. And the energy sector, in fact, has been one of the sectors that has been improving and decarbonizing quite quickly in the latest year. A lot still has to come from the industry and transportation. Sadly, I don't have here projection for the agriculture sector, but again, is a significant reduction in terms of absolute value, in terms of the sheer magnitude of CO2. So what I think, again, this illustration does is that there is an enormous difference between pledges and projected emission reduction. And this calls not just for policy, but also calls for a serious change in the economic and financial incentives. And we need also substantial technological progress too. So let me tell you something about what we're standing in terms of progress today, in terms of policy and in terms of technology. Policy, just a picture on the left-hand side, technology on the right-hand side. We do need stronger incentive to change our economy and societies, and we know that those are needed. And while there are already cases of carbon pricing acting as a stick, forcing some companies to decarbonize in some part of the globe and economy, we all recognize that we need a consistent price on carbon, and that consistent price should be extended to more sectors and implemented in many more jurisdictions. But as you can see from the left-hand side, we already have a substantial number of jurisdictions currently implementing some sort of carbon pricing. Now, what is also important to recognize, and here I just posted a picture from the Bloomberg Green on the right-hand side, for some sectors, without a major technological breakthrough, it will be virtually impossible to significantly decarbonize their operation. So let's look at the iron and steel and the cement, these two cases. Together, these sectors release more than 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide from production processes every year. Racing to net zero, or trying to racing and racing to the reduction of net zero, direct and indirect emission, is extremely hard for iron and steel. And this is because of the lack of current innovation in terms of technologies. So it will require substantial amount of investments. This is potentially the role of finance. Cement industries' commitment to net zero carbon by 2050 is also similarly quite complicated. Cement has a chemist problem. It produces basically carbon dioxide through the process of transforming limestone. And what is, again, this story tells us is that we don't just need innovation, but we also might even need a necessity to switch into new materials. So why all these should concern and should be relevant for finance? Well, besides managed risks that are related to climate change and complying with the usual financial reporting regulation that obviously is becoming more demanding for most of the investor and financial institution, I believe that finance can play a big role in achieving, on helping the economy in achieving a net zero target. Let's now very briefly consider what investor can do. And again, here I have just a very simple illustration. I believe at first, let's think in terms of what finance can do from the lenses of, for example, investors. So what I think they can do, they could divest and exclude from their investment universe those companies that they believe, those sectors and companies that they believe are at the high risk of becoming stranded assets. I would say this is rather a simplistic approach, but is a yet very natural starting point. Second, investor can actively and collaboratively engage with their investee companies to update their businesses, their business model, in order to help them survive and thrive in a net zero economy. So divest and engagement, I think, are two very important aspects for finance. Third, and here comes the investment part, they can also identify opportunities and finance climate solution technologies. So this is where I see a lot of the asset owner and asset managers are playing at the moment a big role in basically investing into new technology. And last, investors are currently putting their money into data and financial technologies, all data and financial technology that can have a potential that can help us to shift in a fairer more efficient and greener economy. So there is this emerging, I would say, area that is labeled climate fintech, where again financial institutions and investors are putting some money. So I'll park for the moment here. I'll say a few words maybe later in terms of research, and I'll give now the floor to my colleague Theodor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. That's a great overview and very helpful to our watchers and listeners and those tuning in for the Fundación. And would like to hand over now to Theodor to talk a bit more about green finance taxonomy and current developments as well, leading on from Luca's session. So Theodor, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you for having me here. Equally, thank you so much, Luca, for the introduction, as well as to the Fundación for having us. It's an exciting topic that I'm delighted to talk about, that I hope will build nicely onto Luca's great overview, which then enables me to get straight into the topic of green taxonomies. I'd love to tell you more into why they emerged and practically what they are aiming to perhaps do in this sometimes confusing world where, as Luca showed us, although we have this clear goal of getting us to going to net zero, the solutions aren't always as straightforward in the real world, where we're trying to match technology with finance, and there are numerous reasons for that. Can I kindly ask that you can see my screen well and perfect? So what I'd love to talk to you today, and perhaps have some points of reflection, is what have we tried so far? What are the types of solutions that we've tried which haven't yet amounted to the level of change that we want to see? Then I'd like to give you a bit of insight into green taxonomies, which are this policy tools. It's a policy tool that is emerging around the world, and look what are the design elements, and hopefully help anyone who wants to find out more to frame the discussion of how these are designed. And last but not least, perhaps tell you a bit about the divestment movement, which Luca also mentioned, a potential key strategy that investors can employ, and perhaps also just mention to you about debt denial, which is alongside Luca's two, engagement and divestment, perhaps is the third potential strategy that could be interesting to explore. Okay, so what have we tried? And we have quite a long history in terms of a financial sector trying to get to grasp of what environmental and social investing is, and what finance can really do in terms of delivering financial returns, but also perhaps taking into account environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment decision making, and in some cases not only taking it into account, but actually also delivering environmental and social benefits alongside financial benefits. And we have numerous initiatives, and I won't go in every one of them, but it's interesting to note that it all started with very large equity portfolios where investors would just look and classifying companies really simply in the 1990s as good or bad, in particular with respect to an environmental or social objective. We've evolved since then, and we had many institutions starting to look through the same lens, whether it's banks, and that's with the emergence of the Equator Principles in 2003, whether they're institutional investors, so large pension funds, insurance companies who signed the UN Principles for Responsible Investment pledge in 2006, and then more recently we've had a lot of bodies that try to standardize what we mean by climate change data, what we mean by environmental data and social data, and so on. But this created a really, large, diversified pool of initiatives, which all tackled very individual parts of what being sustainable actually means. And so that meant that investors were often confused into how can they really invest responsibly? Or as Luca outlined, how can we really, in the case of climate change, how can we really do Paris-aligned investing? And so green taxonomies are a response from policymakers, particularly on the side of financial regulators, which really seek to clarify which are those environmentally sustainable technologies that, or economic activities that investors could direct capital towards. And as you would see in this figure, now many countries around the world, led of course by European Union, we have an initial attempt and already a law, a Climate Delegated Act, where the European Union established which environmentally sustainable technologies could be invested in by investors and also claimed as sustainable in their investment portfolios. We have the UK considering onshoring the EU legislation and then modifying it to suit the UK economy. We have Canada, South Africa, Russia, and so on. So we have these plethora of initiatives around the world which are trying to define. Sometimes they go on the scientific end and they say scientifically, this is what green means. Some of it, as you can imagine, might be politically motivated, where not necessarily science doesn't always transpire into these green taxonomies, but we'll get to that and we'll see why science is actually an important design feature of a green taxonomy. So I say the word taxonomy, but what does it actually mean in practice? So a taxonomy is really a common language or a clear definition of what sustainability actually is. So it is a data dictionary, pretty much like a label in a way, which looks at different types of economic activities, whether they're related to agriculture or energy and so on, and tells us whether they are indeed going to take us, in the case of climate change, whether they are going to deliver the low carbon economy or not. And these taxonomies are really meant to help investors to provide an appropriate signal and certainty to economic actors, but also to investors. In principle, it should make it easier to raise capital, as everyone would have this standardized definition of what environmental sustainability actually is. And of course, it provides a good basis for further policymaking and improvement as we go along. So far, the European Union has been able to provide a green taxonomy in the Delegated Act, based on which companies will have to report against in the area of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance is currently working on the draft criteria for a circular economy, biodiversity, water and pollution prevention, which are the other 4 environmental objectives that are being tackled as part of this green taxonomy set. Okay, so as you've seen, depending on the green taxonomy of the country or union that you might be looking at, the question is, what are some of these important design features of green taxonomies? How do we know, if a taxonomy is really going to get us, or is going to deliver, for example, a low carbon world, a net zero world ideally? And what should we look for, as all of these are popping up all over the world? And the 5 that I'd love for us to explore are: they use the precautionary principle in the design. And the precautionary principle means that if you are not sure whether a technology is green or not, then do not declare it green. And this gets to the point about science. This particular precautionary principle is also enshrined in EU law, and I very much hope it will be enshrined in the design of other taxonomies emerging around the world. They're also forward-looking. As Luca showed us that, beautiful graph in scenario that would take us to net zero, we equally need to know from our economic activities from the companies that are actually investing in accordance to that trajectory. And that's why CapEx disclosures are key. So we need to know how you're investing today to deliver to tomorrow's low carbon world. We also need to know that these disclosures by companies are independently verified. it is very easy to game numbers, and it is very easy to have perhaps assumptions that are not necessarily scientific. And that's why independent verification is important. The fourth bit is that it's really important that these particular disclosures are actually accompanied by other types of disclosure regulations for investors, for example. So in Europe, what's interesting is that we not only say which technologies are green and which ones are not, but we also tell companies that they have to disclose and tell us whether they invest in these types of technologies. We also tell investors now that they have to disclose themselves how their financial products invest in these types of technologies and economic activities. So as you see, we have to create this type of alignment between company level data, investor decision-making, and policy and science in the middle that can ensure the actual flow of capital towards green economic activities and away from fossil fuel intensive business models. And then last but not least, if we only had a data dictionary that would tell us what's sustainable today, we wouldn't be making the 2050 goal. And the reason for that is we need to get better over time, as that declining balance showed us. So we need our criteria to get more and more stringent over time to show that we're actually delivering the low carbon economy. So for now, I would have a few more slides, but I would actually stop here and perhaps have a discussion. And then as we discuss, I would have maybe one or two more slides to show you inspired from the research, as well as a few more slides that actually illustrate, I think, each of these points depending on the interest. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Theodor. Thank you very much indeed for that presentation. Just before we come back to Luca, I wanted to ask you a question from the map you showed there, which was very interesting and illustrated, I think, some of the challenges at the global level. So here you have Russia, in terms of taxonomy and understanding that these are a very fundamental building blocks of understanding and defining finance and climate change, on top of which the building blocks can be created. But I think without that standardized taxonomy, it's very difficult for countries to claim they are doing something when they're not, or for other countries to be able to be quite advanced through a set of either globally standardized or regionally standardized taxonomies of what green finance should and could represent. So I think it's a critical part of the long-term, short, medium, long-term journey for climate change and climate finance to understand that. But there are notable omissions here with North America and Australia, for example, and the Middle East in the developing and middle income worlds. Is there a reason for that? Is there a point at which you mentioned lobbying, or you mentioned their particular connection with fossil fuel dependence or extractive industries? And to what extent, why is Russia in the lead, as it were, or already in place, and some other notable countries, advanced countries, are not even yet creating that taxonomy? Just before we come back to Luca.
Sure. And I wouldn't say necessarily anyone is in the lead per se. So the European Union was the first one in a way to put the Climate Delegated Act and criteria. And something notable to say is that there are many taxonomies, including the UK's one, including South African one, and many others that are inspired from the EU work. So they will onshore part of the criteria and then adopt them depending on their domestic circumstances. And this is what's really important when it comes to climate change. What is environmentally sustainable? It's in a way not up to politicians to decide. It's really a scientific question. But because, of course, these have to be onshored, and there's quite a political process behind the adoption and the legislation, often, as you mentioned, you have lobbying that creeps in and all sorts of interests, which basically from the sciences Luca showed us, we have a clear pathway if we want to make, a 2050 net zero carbon goal. But if our own economy is dependent on gas and politicians are not willing to give that up, then we end up with taxonomies that are not really fit for that purpose. So even in the case of Europe or any other country, we know how the ideal taxonomy would look like. But at the moment, what it is to say is that we are not really there because even the European taxonomy hasn't implemented that declining threshold design element in it. It was originally in the draft criteria, but it has been taken out when the final legislation was put in place, which means we are always, battling, politics with science. And so, yeah, in that respect, I wouldn't say anyone is leading yet, because the bar for leading is actually quite high to make sure you are not greenwashing towards a low carbon world.
Thank you. Okay, great. Well, Luca, let's come back to you to give us some examples, I think, of the instruments and financial products within green finance and the role therein. I think there's some interesting data here that will illustrate some of the developments in this particular field. So over to you.
Thanks. I'll take the opportunity to show a couple of examples that are in a way inspired by the research that we're currently doing. So let me, if you don't mind, share again my slides. So there's something that we've been examining that is the demand for coverage, in a way, in terms of credit risk. And we did that because it's extremely difficult for investor to discriminate between companies when it comes to their exposure to climate change, whether this is a physical type of effect of climate change or even regulatory types of effects of climate change, meaning that you might be regulated by a more stringent type of regulation that obviously might potentially have impact on your business in different ways. So as I initially said, it may be easy and simple to simply drop the companies that investors or believe they are extremely exposed, but then you have the remaining universe of investments is still there, and you need to have a way to discriminate, to distinguish, to have a way to quantify the differential exposure to climate change. And what we're doing, and this is just an illustration, we've been trying to look into the data and trying to see what the data tell us with respect to demand for protection. We did that by looking at the credit default swap. More specifically, we've been quantifying the change in credit default swap between a category of company that we quantify or we identify as the one that is least exposed to climate change, and another category of companies that we identify as to be the most exposed to climate change. Now, what you see here is the development of that metric that we created, and we call it transition risk. So what we've been doing here, we just focused on one particular sector or segment of climate change, that is the regulatory part, the market price part that is reflected into that demand for higher protection. And that evolution of a transition risk peaks in a particular period, that is the Paris Agreement. So there is a higher demand for protection in relative terms. So the change in demand for higher protection for those companies that the market itself believes to be more exposed to transition risk, and equivalently a lower demand for those companies that are less exposed to this transition risk. So this is one form of analysis that could basically generate a product, if you like, that we just name it climate default swap. So it's basically, again, a demand for a protection in light of a potential default triggered by an increase in the effort request for higher regulation, more stringent regulation. And then we have also another emerging area of research. This is a partnership between the African Conservation Development Group and the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE, we launched something that is called the Forest Lab. There are different programs within the Forest Lab, but there is one specific program that is looking into conservation finance. So the idea here is to leverage on the work we've been doing at the Grantham in terms of developing a specific model, in fact, spatially explicit models where we use basically maps, very detailed maps as a source of information to come up with new metrics that will allow us to assess performance-based products. So in a way, for example, here we can help all the investors that are interested in investing in sustainable linked forestry products. That could be a loan, that could be a bond, and help them quantify whether that particular type of targets in terms of a reduction of deforestation or actually increase in afforestation has been achieved. And usually what is happening here is that the loan or the coupon in the bond is associated, is a function, is connected to that particular target.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luca. And coming back to that issue that you're talking about, we discussed earlier also the prevalence or the interest in financial markets of green bonds per se, and the issuance and the market therein globally. Perhaps you could describe to us a bit more about how they work, or what kind of bonds are in the marketplace and what kind of appetite there has been for these relatively new financial products.
Yeah, so there has been a growing demand for green bonds, in particular for bonds that are related to or associated to the type of investments that can be perceived as green. And we go back to what Theodor was just discussing. Very difficult. There is a very wide range of different activities can be characterized as less or more green. The appetite has been increasing, I suspect, for two reasons. One is the ones that want to issue, the companies that want to issue bonds, they still have basically an alternative of issuing traditional normal bonds and also green bonds. If you're a relatively large company, you want to play both. You want to actually issue the traditional one and the green bonds. Green bonds tend to be still a relatively small fraction of the total issuance of bonds, and you want to do that because there might be I believe from an issuer perspective, a reputational aspect associated to that. And for investors, well, green bonds at this stage, and I haven't done directly research on that, but I've been reading quite a lot. There's no necessarily identified presence of peculiarity that makes the green bonds better than the standard bonds. There is really no greenium, what is usually called greenium, as green premium. So you don't really get paid more or less necessarily for the very fact that you were demanding green bonds. I believe that, again, the demand has been increasing because the idea of investing into green products, investing in sustainable products has been just emerging. What I think will be in future important is, again, we go back to Theodor, compelling understanding of, we need to understand what is what exactly is qualifiable and quantifiable as green, and how that can be properly incorporated into the payoff of these type of investments.
Thank you. Theodor, coming back to you for your take on that as green bond issuance and what can be defined or standardized as a green financial instrument or product. Whilst it's under definition, is this something you see increasing demand for, perhaps from the EU point of view?
Absolutely. So I suppose when you look at the design of a green bond, the first element was that it's actually ring-fenced most of the time. It doesn't have to always be, but if you're doing a green bond and you ring-fence it against an asset like a wind farm or suite of assets, then that becomes a bit more transparent, and your green bond is going into in the case of the power sector, we know which technologies will deliver a net zero world, and we know which ones don't. I think that the debate is closing scientifically quite a lot, although the politics might tell us otherwise. So that I think works really well. What's a bit more challenging is now with the taxonomies, as we're defining these taxonomies, ideally you would have green bonds ring-fenced to these economic activities. So then a company will say, look, I am issuing this green bond to do, as Luca's example was, to do green steel manufacturing, right, as defined by a green taxonomy. And so there will be, I think, increasing appetite of green bonds linked to these taxonomies going forward. But that being said, there are still some challenges because, as we've discussed, the taxonomy itself doesn't yet tell us that how green is getting more stringent. And so we still have a lot of questions that we're debating as to whether a green bond that is issued in 5 years from now on the same economic activity, whether that criteria will be more stringent for that green bond than a green bond that we issue today. How will we judge them on par? Do we allow grandfathering? So there's still a few of the design elements, I think, that we're still trying to work out. But I think on, overall, green bonds have brought, I think, a lot of the attention towards taxonomies and more scientific definitions of green that we were missing, because I think the financial markets were encouraged to see that there's at least one green product that scales incredibly well. And I think that gave some momentum to the market.
Thank you, Theodor. And I think this brings us to another interesting point where we've been discussing to a large extent institutional investors and financial markets as issuers and investors in green bonds in the marketplace. But there's an increasing amount of consumer pressure in terms of what their institutions, their pension funds, or a number of different funds are investing in, and therefore the transparency therein and the demand to have X% of your portfolio moving from fossil fuels into green bonds, or certainly away from fossil fuels in the first place. So is that a kind of at a more retail level, I would say, but there is an increasing amount of pressure in that, and to an extent, the climate change and the role of finance in climate change driving some of that pressure by demanding that companies either divest or invest in more green products within a portfolio from different generations, I think. So is that something that is also helping drive the market in terms of the green finance and bonds, but in particular how those portfolios are perhaps being adapted to consumer or retail pressure from investors?
Maybe I'll give it a go, Theodor, and then you can definitely complement that. I think there is a noticeable change in the way, for example, banks, but also credit card providers they're changing basically the offer, and they're changing the offer to, I believe, to meet a specific demand, but also to create an extra product that maybe provides you some sort of new competitive advantage. So this, as you exactly pictured, Adam, there is definitely a demand from retailers to understand better. I've got my pension is invested into that particular type of pension fund. How exactly that pension fund is constituted? Can that constituent tell me something about the associated contribution to climate change, for example? But that is relatively static as a picture, because once I know that, it's very difficult for me to change the constituents of my pension funds. I might be able to rank different products, but that's pretty much it. There are, though, and that was the last category I was indicating, this climate fintech, if you like, for the lack of a better definition. There is, though, growing interest from consumers to, okay, what can I do? Can I do something differently in order to contribute less to climate change, or actually do my part in terms of tackling climate change. And that's connected to what I was saying about credit card. For example, MasterCard and the Visa, giving you a very simple calculator, carbon footprint calculator. So you see what your spending is associated to a certain level of CO2 emissions. There you do have an active role. You can actually spend things differently and noticeably see a reduction in your spending. There are also banks that are trying to come up with products that in a way reward certain change in the behavior. There are banks that are trying to understand whether they could play with the interest rates in order to, for example, for mortgages, reduce mortgage rate for those households that are more efficient in the way they retrofit, for example, the house. So I see two basically, again, possibility for financial institutions in general. One is, yes, there is a specific demand coming from consumers and retailers. Let's try to intercept that demand, but also create products that are product again that satisfy a demand, but also provide for them a new competitive advantage.
Thank you. Yes, I think that seems to be clear, and increasingly so with, as I say, the well-researched connectivity between financial literacy on one hand, which is about investing in pension funds in general, and how that is trying to explain to the general public about the options within pension funds across the world is a big challenge. But I think the climate change and green agenda is helping that process forward in a sense, because people are now actively looking for what kind of investments their bank, their credit card, their pension fund, or other institutional parts of their financial portfolio are investing in or planning to, and what their movements are, and to some extent making a statement on behalf of themselves or as groups or as investors about the positions of those institutions, or moving from one fund to another depending on what that portfolio contains. So seems to be something that can grow. But Theodor, what's your take on that in terms of a consumer movement and potential to give visibility and impact to green finance?
Sure. I echo a lot what Luca said, and it's undoubtedly we all witnessed the fact that, the millennial generation, now that it's taken, at least in the US, I think more than 50% of the workforce and so on, we see similar statistics around the world. People have different preferences on how their money are managed, for example, in accordance to their values. And so this trend is pervasive, and to me, it's clear we're moving in that direction. But maybe I can be a bit provocative or not necessarily provocative, but maybe just alert to the fact that sometimes we use this argument that of the retail consumer, we make it a demand side, and particularly a retail demand side of a question that might solve problems. And as you've said, Adam, this can be a driver. What I've seen, though, the argument, though, being used, and it's not just about green financial products, but we look at it as, buying, electric cars, or, using less energy in your home, or whatever it is, having a better diet. I've seen the argument being put on individual people like you and me, and that's often used as a distraction tool by those who institutionally should demand it. So there's part of it where I think there's a supply problem. As Luca said, we cannot build any new fossil fuel power plants. That we know for sure. No new fossil fuel power plants. And that is a supply question. We will need energy, and energy demand will go up. So that is also clear, but we don't need any new fossil fuel power plants. So there's a supply question. And then there's a demand question that I think it's also good to look at, which is, as you've also guided us to the discussion, the institutional demand, which I think should be the one that should sort all this out. Because then if we go at the level of the consumer, how are we going to explain the different facets of green taxonomies, and how green in agriculture is different from green in the power sector, and why should we? It's the same with healthcare to a certain extent. There are many, decisions that the healthcare system takes for us whenever we have cardiac issues and so on, that you might not know all about why we're doing that or why we're arranging the healthcare system like it. But these decisions are made for us institutionally. And I think consumers should put pressure on their politicians and indeed on their pension funds, but not necessarily to make the decisions themselves, but to at least have some assurance at the level of the legislation that is aligned with indeed their goals, and in this case, net zero, that we see that clear trajectory implemented in legislation. And then at the actual murky implementation, I think the consumer, even myself, if I wouldn't be in this field, I would be completely lost in some respects. So I would, it's just an alert that I wanted to bring up, because we often talk about drivers, but ultimately I still think we need to put the pressure where it matters, and not distract with what you and me can do in our daily lives.
Absolutely. No, quite agree. I think one of the ways in which pension funds seem to be working as well, where, let's say, public sector pension funds, some of the largest pension funds in any country, or in many countries indeed, but where possibilities to push on the political agenda might lead to things like where the default fund for a pension, where the choice is large, but where the default fund becomes a sustainable and green fund, where if you don't opt for any other choices, you end up in something that's sustainable, that would have to be a political construct in a sense, but that would be popular due to public demand or to public pressure at the same time. So those kind of large scale developments or switches can happen, but I quite agree that it has to come from pressure, not on the fund itself, but on the policy about those investment funds from the top, and that those could make significant changes, I think. So just in the short amount of time we have left, a few minutes left, I wanted to just discuss broadly the way in which the international community, let's say, through the COP processes that have been underway for some time now. You mentioned the first green bond in 2007, and the spike that Luca mentioned in 2016 of the Paris Accord. Now we have a long-term, regular process. Is that process helping in general to drive some of the more important aspects of finance and climate change? Has it become higher up on the agenda, or is it, as you were saying, Theodor, as well, it's a lot more different items that are getting priority in terms of combating climate change, such as trying to drive no more fossil fuel plants? That has to be the sequencing, and the priorities have to be clearly defined and agreed upon. But is that something, where does green finance fit in that overall process? Theodor, perhaps you first.
As it is a concluding remark, I don't want to go too much back, but on the investor side, it very much depends on the types of investors we're talking about, whether they're just taking into account all of these trends, or whether they're actively looking to make a difference. And I think as an asset manager, if you want to differentiate yourself in the modern world, you need to have quite a full-fledged strategy and theory of change on why what you do actually impacts the world, and how your engagement activities aligns with your equity investing and other asset classes you might be investing on. So on the one hand, there is that. And then I think when it comes to green finance, you've seen me kind of, and Luca as well, kind of being passionate about, look, we got the power sector right. It is to some level quite simple, in that we need the companies to disclose and to tell us their carbon emissions at the activity level in an accurate manner. We need to know where their capex go, and we need to make sure that new investment is not in the fossil fuel intensive activities, needs to be in the solutions. And if we know all that, it trumps any commitment from a company. It trumps any piece of marketing, right? Because then it's in the numbers, and we see it go over time. The issue is that we're not there yet. It is that we have a huge layer of marketing and legal kind of tweaked figures and so on, that we never seem to get the raw data, which we know consultants can do, and many consultants do these assessments for companies, but somehow it doesn't make up in the public, doesn't make it to the public domain. So I think we're still working on that latter point, really understanding what's going on.
Sure, thank you. Luca, final few words from you. Thank you.
Thanks. I believe that as a process itself, every COP brings at the table new elements. And I think if I can just be brief and connect to the point that Theodor was making, the earlier point about we don't need distraction. I think that more recently COP brought to the table the need for extra regulation. And I think not a relatively recent, and it's a relatively recent topic that I hear also from in the finance sector, but also not just the finance institution, but also companies. They are also looking at the regulators as a way of please lead me, tell me what I need to report, what will be the standards that we need to report in terms of data, because that is the type of data that we need. It cannot be just I'll be net zero by 2050. It can be a genuine pledge. It can be a genuine belief of the company, but we need to see that in a transparent and consistent way. Financial Conduct Authority has been very recently putting together a set of metrics and measures that need to be disclosed. So I think that the pledge that has been, the request that actually, has been done in terms of more regulation resonate very well with me. I think we need more regulation.
Well, thank you. We are out of time, but thank you so much to both of you for joining in this fantastic seminar of critical importance in some of the challenges that the world is facing in climate change. And it seems to me that one of the potential helpful solutions, or certainly is the communication of explaining and understanding what the problems are, and for people such as yourselves to have the data to be able to make the policy arguments that can then help change strategically and structurally the necessary implementation and policies that we need worldwide to combat climate change. So I am, as you know very well, a keen supporter of that and the science behind that, and especially from institutions at Queen's University and LSE, and more broadly at Edinburgh as well, and many of the other institutions that you work with, and the Commission, of course, playing a leading role. So delighted to get all of those perspectives. Thank you so much for joining the seminar today. And for our friends at the Fundación Ramón Areces, great to be hosted by you once again, and look forward to our next seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.